It's the Book of Nahum. Some of these books are more familiar than others when you look at them, and you recognize Hosea, you recognize Micah even, a lot of these minor prophets. So today my goal is just strictly to give you kind of an overview. We're not going to even dive into the verses themselves. We're going to look at some of the different aspects that help put the prophet into line with the historical settings, the goals, the structure of the book, and just look at it that way and discuss some of the important significance of it. And that's basically what we're going to do. And the next week, it's a short book, three chapters. But again, like a lot of the minor prophets, what he has to say in 3 chapters is powerful. They're always very powerful. The outline is kind of interesting. The first chapter is kind of, again, like Micah's, bringing out forward that charge of the reason and justification. The timeline, again, is very close to Micah. It's a lot closer to the fall of Nineveh, and that's Assyrian capital. So, the message is continuing to go out to Assyria and warn them, and the message is also still kind of to Judah. By this time, when he's writing, the 10 northern tribes have gone away, so Judah's gone. Micah was prophesying before they went, and then he actually saw them leave into captivity. And then at that time, one of the invasions by the Assyrians, we see that they threatened and really invaded part of Judah, but Judah doesn't fall. So as time is coming down further to Judah's demise, we're going to see now Nahum comes on the line. So that first, though, this anger against Nineveh, and remember, this is Assyria. So you hear Nineveh, it's the Assyrians. These are the ones that I talk about in my morning lessons about how that Habakkuk was crying out how terrible and ungodly his people were, the northern tribes, and how that they needed to be punished and bring them back into alignment. And when God said he gave Habakkuk the answer, Habakkuk didn't like it. Habakkuk was like, wait a minute, we're really bad and we need some discipline, but why would you take such an evil nation and punish us with them? Now, Nahum is prophesying after the northern tribe has already been taken off. God has already fulfilled that. But now, like he told Habakkuk, God told Habakkuk that when Assyria, his pride rises up and their arrogance and rebellion, then he's going to take care of them. He didn't tell him he was going to do it, but he told him when it happens, if that happens, I'm going to take care of the Assyrians. Well, Nahum's telling them it's going to happen. That first, now Judah's being harassed. Judah, the southern kingdom's all by themselves now, and they're in terror of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are dominating this whole area. We'll look at a map in a little while. So the first message is describing God's character, and we're going to see in that first chapter how it's in Deuteronomy when God presents himself after the golden calves, how God describes himself in his own character. So we're going to see that it highlights his power, justice, and wrath against his enemies and against those. And then 9 through 15, the last part of that chapter, is looking at the destruction and giving Judah some comfort, which is a little comfort. They're going to get a reprieve, but guess who's coming behind them? Babylon. So Judah, you need to really wake up, because you just watched your sister nation kingdom get taken off by the Assyrians in a horrible way. And now God's going to relieve you in a way, because he's going to take and get that thread of those Assyrians from attacking you, but you're going to have a reprieve. It doesn't mean that it's, you're okay now. And then that's kind of the problem sometimes, is when people see a reprieve and kind of okay, we've dodged a bullet on that one, they relax. It's not that, but it is still a message. Even though this letter is very gloomy, it's hopeful. It shows some character, especially when it comes to God and his judgment and consistency in the way he delivers. Chapter 2 is going to describe the siege and the fall of Nineveh, and come right out and describe the attack on Nineveh, which historically becomes something pretty accurate. And so for a man who, in the lack of information age like today, where you don't know, we don't even know that Nahum ever traveled. It's doubtful he ever even visited this city. And he doesn't have the information. His only source of information has to be something supernatural. And that's with a lot of these prophets. It's not like you could use AI and chat GPT and come up with this information and then say, look at this, and say, no, they had nothing. It really showed that these prophets had something very supernatural that they were getting this information from. And of course, this is good news, to them, but it's going to end Nineveh's power. When you say Nineveh, you're saying the Assyrians. So keep that in mind, Nineveh and Assyria. But it's kind of like saying Babylon. When you said Babylon, you were saying really the entire Babylonian kingdom. If you were to say the city of Rome falls, it's a symbol of that. And then chapter 3, and that's the last one, is giving a woe to them and the reason they're going to go down, the reason they're going to fall. And he lists, just like he's done before in other prophets, talking about the very sins in which he is holding them in contempt for. So there's no excuse. You can't escape. You have done this. And he's going to basically say there is no way around this. This is going to happen. It's going to happen. It's not something that if you repent, he might change. Key themes, some themes that we see that are kind of important. And the first greatest one, again, is that theme of God's justice. A lot of times when we read these minor prophets, we get really caught up with all this, destruction, fire, and all this negative stuff that's going on. But understand, God is long-suffering. He has put up with it and put up with it. And if anything, he should take immediate action because he is pure, and anything that's not pure is evil. And so, there's a part of his character you would have to say, you have to do it and do it now. It cannot exist. You cannot let it to happen. So just the fact that he allowed Assyria to last, allow nations to go forward, it really does show that he is trying and long-suffering, but his justice is going to happen, always. There is not a nation that has ever existed or will ever exist that will escape that from it. It clearly then, the next main theme is God's right, his sovereignty. His sovereignty is everything. Everything that is in creation, that is his. Like a president or an emperor, his sovereignty is just the region in which he controls. That's it. So the king of Assyria, the only sovereignty he has is just the boundaries in which he's conquered and he can control. And so this is another way, again, through the prophets, of keep showing that God's sovereignty is everything. He has the right to, because it's his to begin with. You can't exercise authority in an area that's not yours. And that's one of these that keep coming up, his control over the nations and their history as well. And that there is a retribution for wickedness. Again, like even as dark as it is, some of these prophets, as you go through them and you just seem to keep hearing the same negativity, you understand that this is retribution for wickedness. And that's the thing. Nineveh's destruction is going to give that warning to evil nations that are going to come in the future. It should serve as a warning to Judah that's still hanging on by a spiritual thread, just barely hanging on, and they're going to waver back and forth to the point where they're going to also have to be and receive retribution for their wickedness. It is a comfort for the oppressed, because those who are oppressed by evil, it becomes very discouraging. It becomes very disheartening to continually to see how evil seems to progress and win and be comforted by their victories, and as ungodly as they are. And so there's a message to us who are trying to live a good life and we seem to be losing to the evil, that it should comfort us in knowing and seeing these stories where God, he's not asleep. God is very much active, and he's going to bring righteousness, and he's going to allow wickedness certain grace, and then it's over. And it's always going to happen, and it will continue to happen as well. Historically, it's very important. We kind of look at it. We look at the region. I mean, this is a massive territory that was eventually, and you'll hear terms like Neo-Assyria, New Assyria, Neo-Babylon. Those are because Assyria as an empire in total lasted over 300 years. And that's, I mean, how long have we been a nation? And I'm not comparing us to Assyria. We are not in Assyria. But we talked earlier this morning, we're looking at the timeline of nations and how they exist, and we go, wow, how can, God allow these nations to rule and be so evil and ungodly and stuff? But just look, when I looked at the dates, how long from the older structure of Assyria and its rise up has been as long as 300 years. And if you look at this area here, on the upper right-hand side there, you see this word called the Medes. And that, in the Chaldeans in the south, Babylon, are going to end up being the root of the downfall. In our book in Daniel, we were way ahead in the timeline, but this is, and then if you look up at the top, you see where it says Assyria, there's Nineveh. And all of this is really modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, a part of Saudi Arabia, and then some overflowing into modern Iran. But the majority of this is, and the key cities here, Haran, Ashur, and then Nineveh, of course, and they're all around these rivers, and Nineveh as well is one of those. As it rises to power, one of the things it is really recognized historically as one of the first great empires. And it wasn't just because of their brutality. They did build their nation and their empire upon the blood of others and the conquest. But there's a lot of things that they established and brought forward that to this day, many nations and empires have taken and used, as well as Cyrus the Great. So we can wail on them on their morality, but there was some architectural and some art, some literature, some things that they did that did advance. I call it organized civilization or historical, because when you say something's prehistoric, it's not a dinosaur, even though it is in a way, but prehistoric just means before they wrote stuff down. Historic is times when we can actually find and read something, whether it's on a clay stone. So they really are kind of on that edge of where they took societies out of the prehistoric pre-written history and started writing it down, because before that it was oral tradition. You just told the story from grandpa down all the way through. But you start to see languages and being written and on these little cuneiform clays. And the last emperor, he actually started collecting books from all these other nations and started studying, and they said he was probably the most enlightened emperor that they ever had. Didn't say moral, he was still a pretty bad guy when it comes to a lot of the things. Of course, we've already talked about this, but Nineveh was more than just their capital. Nineveh was a major, major city when it comes to the modern society and in the empire. I mean, of all the cities. Egypt, remember, they got crushed by the Jews at first whenever God brought them out. And throughout history, they've struggled to ever really come back to the same level of prominence in the national stage. They've been able to push back some invasions. They fought back against the Assyrians, but as you saw that map, they lost a lot of territory. And then even with Babylon, when Babylon overthrows Assyria, Egypt is still struggling to maintain, but they never, that's what's fascinating, is after God brings a judgment on them and brings out the children of Israel, they never really regained that well-known status ever again. Nineveh itself was a city that was undescribable. I don't know if you've seen some of the archaeological digs they found. For a long time, for centuries, they never could find this city. It was difficult for them to find it. And it goes back again to, if we can't find it, we don't believe it happened, therefore the Bible is a fable. And it was kind of one of those cities, but quickly they found the location of Nineveh and have exhumed a lot of it. And the city walls were massive. I mean, they said you could race 3 chariots beside each other on the top of the wall of the city of Nineveh. It also was very similar to Babylon that I described this morning, that used the water source to where you couldn't cut off their water if you were to attack them. The walls were nearly 100 feet. You can't really scale them. They said nearly 120 towers or more that was watching out. It was over 60 miles in length. It had so much territory and area that they actually had agricultural farmland inside the city wall. And they said it could be up to a 10 to 15-year siege if you wanted to try to take Nineveh. You just were not going to be able to surround it and cut it off. It could feed itself. And that was very rare for most of the cities. So that it was a very invincible city. It would be like us looking up to a city of like New York, of the stature of that level. You go anywhere in the world and you probably say New York, and people go, oh yeah, no matter where you're at, they understand what a great city. And this is what Nineveh was. So it becomes a symbol of it, just like Babylon became a symbol of an ungodly state. And John uses that in Revelation. So it's a center of the power. Now, some of the historical events that are important is the fall of Thebes, which is a city in Egypt. It's another city that was believed to be impermeable. It was very defendable, very difficult to conquer it, and it was conquered. The irony is the actual king who conquered it is the last king of Assyria, Ashurbanipal. He's going to be the last king. So whenever Nahum references it, it's almost like he's going to tell Nineveh, which is an invincible city, that they're going to fall just like the invincible city of Thebes. That you were told. In other words, it's kind of like telling the Assyrians, that invincible city that everybody thought was invincible and you took it down, well, guess what? Nineveh, you're Thebes. And so you're going to see it used as well in there. And the prophecy of it occurred in 612 BC. I mean, it came to pass, and it was a coalition. That's what was kind of interesting, is the dynamics, because the Assyrians were dominating the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and the Sumerians, and so even the Persians. And so as this empire started to crack and fall apart, you find these coalitions. And so the downfall that happens to them is going to be where the Persians, Cyrus the Great, with the Medes, are going to come together, and even some of the Chaldeans, and attack Nineveh and bring them down. And so that besiegement ends up destroying it. And again, it was a shocking event. That's the thing. It was stunning to the world to hear, just like what 9/11 was to the world. Everybody was shocked that something like that could happen. Pearl Harbor, of that generation. It was that shocking that you could do something like that to such a powerful nation. When we look at the timeline, we're looking at, again, between 644 to 612. And so it's going to very clearly cover that timeline. And it's still way past after the Assyrians have taken off the Israelites, the 10 northern tribes, or the northern kingdom. This great judgment on Assyria that's been coming. They're a nasty people. I mean, they had every reason. The cruelty, they are the ones who invented the modern crucifixion of taking people and spearing them alive with poles and putting them outside the city to display the bodies. And that became something that was the brutality, the cruelty that they would inflict on the societies they conquered and displaying them. Alexander the Great came along, and he basically used that same form of crucifixion. And it's not always the cross like we think. There were many forms of it, but the Assyrians were pretty simple. They just basically took a large stick and just pierced you with it and hung you up and a lot of times you were still alive, and just for the shock effect of horror, and that's just a taste of what they would do. And so this is a part of that cruelty that God is bringing against them. The other great thing is the significance of the comfort that was going to come by watching such an evil nation fall. And I think that's true for even us. I think in our history, when we see nations like Germany, what they were doing, and Japan and these evil nations, and when they fall, it you can't help but it's comforting, because I don't know if you recall ever talking to older generation that had to live through those times during war. They didn't know if we were going to win or lose. It was yes, we were a lot more powerful, but I remember, talking to my grandmother, and they really had the thoughts that we may be speaking German or Japanese. There was a fear there. And so to know that those nations then become crushed, it was a comfort to them, and that's something as well. It provides this really vivid portrayal and detail, I think, is what I think, emphasizing that there's no nation so powerful that God can't take them out. And that's one of those great messages that keep coming through all the prophets, that every nation should think about that. We'll just go through pretty quickly. Again, some of the historical things in 633, Thebes falling to them by Ashurbanipal. And again, like I said, he's going to be the last king, and that's a great historical. So it fits with what I'm trying to show is that these historical things are lining up with the prophet, and that's how we can narrow down the window of when these books were written. We find that this is also during the time of Manasseh, if you recall that king. He was pretty ungodly himself, and some of the human sacrifices and things that happened to him. And it was also the Assyrians that took him out of power for a period of time and led him away with hooks in his cheeks. And he humbled himself, and he ended up going back and ruling. We find during this time as well that King Josiah, a very young boy, comes to ruling. And the religious reforms that he tries to undo from his grandfather Manasseh took effect, extended the length and the life of Judah a few years, because he came in and started making these reforms. And the greatest thing is, like I said, this empire was 300 years. So one of the great things as well is we start to see the crumbling of this historic empire that starts to come apart. And then we witness, and during this timeline of Nahum, is what's going on while he's writing this is the rise of the Babylonian Empire with King Cyrus, which is another fulfillment of prophecies that have already been spoken. So these are all events that are kind of happening around. Now, who else is talking? Now, there's a lot of times we think that the prophets that were speaking were the ones that we have in our Bible. And I can't say there were more, but that's not the purpose of the ones we have, are specifically for us. The message many times was the same message. God didn't have a bajillion different sermons and messages that he sent in all these different men. Very often, they were very much the same message. So why give us, 15 books of Nahum that were exactly the same? But God didn't have the modern technology. I mean, he used men and multiple men to go forward and be teaching the same message at the same time. So I have no doubt, we know there's other books of the prophets and different letters. Some can be credible and some are not. And so to me, the ones we have are absolutely the ones that God intended for us to have. And that's what bothers me, is some scholars saying, with Micah, Micah and Isaiah have the exact same verses. And the one that blew me away was one saying, well, we don't know exactly who copied who. I'm like, it didn't copy if it's the same author, right? If God's the guy writing it, nobody's plagiarizing. It just blew me away. I was like, is it only me that can see that? I mean, I'm like, well, I don't sit and make up 15 bajillion stories. If I tell a fishing story, I tell a fishing story. You know, I tell it the same way and exaggerate it maybe, but you know what? It's the same story, and I'm the one speaking, and it's God that's speaking through these men. So, you know, when we say, well, there's a lot of other books out there, there probably is. I have no doubt, you know. But these are important ones. And even though it may be a 3-chapter book, it has some very specific things that we're going to see as we pull through. But some of the prophets that were in the same timeline is Habakkuk. Now, remember what I've been picking on him already. I picked on him this morning in my sermon, and I picked on him just now about how that Habakkuk was the guy screaming to God, saying, please come punish this northern kingdom. They're so evil. And then when God gave him the answer, he's like, oh, well, not them. Well, this is the same timeline. And it's interesting, you know, sometimes I wonder, I don't know when he died or when he lived, but I wonder if he ever got the letter from Nahum. You know, this is really crazy. I know I'm being a little silly, but, you know, if he would have got the letter from Nahum, he would have been comforted because he was like so worried. Because by the time, honestly, that Nahum writes, Habakkuk is standing in the dust of Assyria, dragging the kingdom away. And he's seeing this brutality inflicted upon them going, okay, you really spanked them hard. You were rough on them. Okay, you're God. I get it. But then the letter that Nahum would have brought, the good news would have been, they're going next. It's going to happen. The other thing real quick, and then we'll just kind of wrap it up, is this isn't the first time God has sent a message to Nineveh. Remember the first one? Jonah? So we're going to talk about that because that's important. A century before, God sent a prophet. So a lot of times, again, we think, well, God only sent these prophets to his people. And that's wrong. We don't know what all the other nations he sent them to, but if we can conclude through the prophets that God is sovereign, that means everything is his, that God is the one who allows nations to rule, and that God, we could see from Daniel like this morning, that God was giving those kings, you know, opportunity to understand what they were doing was wrong, and that he was injecting and punishing and correcting them. And then when we read about Jonah, this prophet who is sent off to a Gentile nation, then we have to understand as well that God has been interacting and interacts with all the world leaders because he's the one that allows them to rule. And so Nahum is just one of those little stories. But I could just imagine if Habakkuk was still alive, if he was able to read Nahum's letter, it would have helped to consolidate and console him as well. So that's all the letter for tonight. This afternoon we'll cover. Next week we'll dive into that first chapter and then look at the structure of it. And the last 2 chapters are really just poetry. They're set up in a real Hebrew type of poetry, the way that it develops through. So if you're with us this evening and there's something that we can do for your, do with and for your relationship with God, I hope that you will take a moment while we sing this song. And if we can assist you at all, let us know while we stand and sing.